Hello and welcome to the video lecture on transactions. The author in the book really gives us maybe one full page associated with transactions, which is really selling transactions short, to be quite honest with you. But I'm going to do my best to flesh this out a bit. So transactions is a discrete unit of work. It may involve multiple tables, and the idea would be that if anything within this transaction fails, and typically a transaction is associated with the manipulation of data, either updating data, deleting data, inserting data, if anything fails in the midst of a transaction, then the whole thing gets canceled. So the classic transaction example is the ATM example. So you walk over to an ATM machine and you put your card in and you type in your PIN and you transfer money from your savings account to your checking account to cover, a bill that you just paid. All sounds well and good until before you get the receipt, the ATM that you're standing in front of gets struck by lightning. We're gonna refer to that as a catastrophic failure. So there's a catastrophic failure, and now you're standing in front of this, probably for all intents and purposes, molten piece of metal, and you didn't get your receipt. So what just happened? Did the money get moved? Did it get struck by lightning after it withdrew the money from savings, but before it put it into checking? As databases developed, that actually is a consideration, a serious consideration. People lost money way back in the day. Obviously, it doesn't happen anymore. So what we do is we wrap things in a transaction. We wrap all those, in this case, those two distinct tasks in a transaction. We start a transaction, then we try to update your savings account by subtracting $500. Then we try to update your checking account record by adding in. If anything happens in between there before that transaction ends, or what we are going to refer to as committing the transaction, if things aren't committed, then they get what's called rolled back. So if, in this scenario, it had withdrawn $500, and then a catastrophic failure occurred before it could deposit it back into checking, since the transaction did not successfully complete, it would roll back the withdrawal of the $500 from your savings account, and your savings account dollar amount balance would be restored to what it was before the catastrophic failure. So the SQL commands, and again, this is kind of a continuation of SQL, but it's not select statement, it's not necessarily DML. So we have a begin transaction and an end transaction statement, which marks the boundaries of the transaction. We'll look at another slide in just a moment. There is a commit, which makes all the updates permanent. You can think of the commit as actually writing to disk. Before anything gets written to disk, it's stored in memory. As soon as a commit happens, for all intents and purposes, you can think of it as, I'm going to write this to disk, so that it's permanently saved. A rollback would cancel all the updates since the last time a commit was committed or executed. And within a transaction, you can have multiple commits, but the rollback usually goes back to either the begin transaction, or it can actually go past, even further back than the begin transaction. So typically, before you start a transaction, you should do a commit on any other work that you've been doing, because if you do a rollback, it'll roll back all the way back to the last time you executed a commit. So let's take a look at a graphical representation of what's going on in a transaction. So here we've got our begin transaction statement, and then we've got a number of insert statements that are going to be executed. Remembering the way our database is set up, we've got an order table and we've got an order line table. And the order line table is going to keep track of the date and the customer involved. and the order line table is going to keep track of the products that are bought and how many of that product were associated with this order. So there you see the insert statements that would have to happen in order for us to submit an order. So at the end of the transaction, if everything was valid and all the information was inserted properly, then you commit your work. So all the changes are made permanently. If, for instance, we get to the second insert statement, which is the first insert statement associated with the order line T table, if we supply a product ID that does not exist in the product table, right? Remember, we have referential integrity set up. So if we try to put in a product ID that doesn't exist in the product table, the transaction is going to be aborted with an error, right? The transaction is going to get aborted, and then the database management system is going to issue a rollback to get rid of all the changes that we already made to the order T table. Because remember, that insert statement already executed. Then we go to insert the next insert statement. We run into an error. That initial insert statement is going to get rolled back, and everything is going to be left as it was before this transaction started. And then what we would have to do is catch that error and give an error message to the user to let them know that they gave us an invalid product ID. And hey, maybe I'll get into that in a later video lecture when we get into application development. So, unfortunately, that is the extent of transactions. We're going to talk about transactions and the whole concept of committing and rolling back in a later chapter when we talk about disaster recovery. But for now, understand that most transactions, most update processes are associated with transactions, and that is pretty much how transactions work. So that is the end of my video lecture on transactions.